Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Javar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. And we're getting into rocky terrain here. We want to know about dividing the field into respects to Peah for one Peah or two Peah. But now we're talking about maybe areas around Jerusalem that are very, very hilly and very, very rocky. As you drive into the highway into Jerusalem today, you can see villages on the side of the road from a long time ago and on very steep inclines. And if you go for a walk today in the Jerusalem hills, you'll see a lot of hilly terrain with steep inclines and lots of rocks all over the place. So now we want to know about planting a field where maybe you're in one of these villages a long time ago and you're planting wheat or barley on an incline. What's going to be the law? The Mishnah gets going and it says, if a field is cut by a water channel that is so wide that its banks cannot be harvested together, Rabbi Yehuda said it divides the field for Peah. So now before we were talking about a water channel that was very narrow. Today we're talking about a water channel that is so wide in this Mishnah that it's so wide that it breaks up the harvest. So Rabbi Yehuda says in the Mishnah it divides the field for Peah. And the Mishnah considers the law for a field in which the hill is situated. Again, this very, very rocky, hilly terrain in the Jerusalem hills. And the Mishnah says, and all the hills that are dug with a hoe, in other words, any hill that has to be tilled manually, even though it is so steep that an ox cannot go with their plowing tools, one gives a single Peah for everything. In other words, a single Peah is going to suffice for both the hill and the adjacent land. Again, now we're talking about a hill that can be tilled, but it has to be done so manually. You can't use oxes or any kind of machinery to do it. And this could also be understood as a hilly field where the surface has a lot of gullies and a lot of mounds, and it's just uneven terrain that can't be plowed in straight lines. Rather, there's depressions and elevations, and each one has to be plowed separately. And the Mishnah is teaching that despite this patchwork of plowing that you have to do manually, there's no need to consider each mound or each gully as separately obligated in Peah. It's saying that rather the continuity of the crop across this uneven ground unites the entire area into a field. So the Mishnah, so the Gemara is going to get into what the Mishnah was talking about with the water channel. In other words, Rabbi Yehuda in the Mishnah is talking about that if the banks cannot be harvested together, it divides the field. The Gemara is now going to talk about whether other Tanaim disagree with Rabbi Yehuda, or maybe there's no malochet at all. So the students of the academy, were inclined to say that Rabbi Yehuda and the sages do not disagree. But a Baraisa was found that teaches to the contrary, that a constantly flowing water channel indeed divides a field. And the Baraisa continues that Rabbi Yehuda says that if its sides cannot be harvested together, it divides a field. And thus we see that unlike Rabbi Yehuda, the sages view a water channel as a separation, even if its sides can be harvested together. So in the Mishnah, where it was talking about a canal in the last Mishnah, it's referring to one where the banks cannot be harvested. It refers to a bank where the banks cannot be harvested together. And the Tana Kama of the last Mishnah did not set a minimum for the width of this channel for irrigation. And this Mishnah now is going to have this dissenting view of Rabbi Yehuda, who holds that it does affect division only if it's so wide that its banks cannot be harvested together. So the last Mishnah was talking about a more narrow channel, and this one is talking one that's so wide that it creates such a big separation that it can't be done all at once. And the sages are stipulating in the Brisa that the channel must be constantly flowing. And the Rambam is going to say in Hilchos Matanos Aniyim that Rabbi Yehuda also refers to such a channel, adding that it must have a certain width. And Rabbi Yehuda holds, according to what the Rambam is saying, that if the two sides of the channel cannot be harvested together, divides the field even without constantly flowing water. So you can see where one side is talking about flowing water, not flowing water, very narrow channel, very, very wide channel, where it's so wide that it can't be harvested together, whether it's going to be flowing or not flowing. That's what this Mishnah is talking about. So Rabbi Yehuda here is making a refinement on the last point. The last point that we were talking about in the last halacha was about a more narrow irrigation channel, and now you have a very, very, very wide one. So the Gemara is going to clarify Rabbi Yehuda's ruling that a channel divides the field into two banks as being, quote, can't be harvested together. And they, the students of the academy, says the Sugya, were inclined to say that according to Rabbi Yehuda, if the water channel is relatively narrow, so that a person standing on one bank cannot harvest the other bank, but if he were standing in the middle of the channel, he could harvest both sides, it does not divide the field, says the Sugya. In other words, Rabbi Yehuda does not regard a channel as a separation unless it is so wide that the two sides cannot be harvested together under any circumstance, even by someone standing inside the channel itself. So the Sugya continues. It says, however, a Brisa was found that teaches to the contrary. Even if the channel is relatively narrow, so that one who was standing in the middle of the channel can reap both sides, it still divides the field, providing that a person standing on one bank cannot reap the field on the opposite bank. But if a person standing on one bank can reap the opposite bank, it does not divide the field. So when Rabbi Yehuda said that the two banks cannot be harvested together, he was referring to a harvester standing on one of the banks, on one side of the banks, and a field is divided even by such a channel, and certainly by a wider one whose sides cannot be harvested by person standing in the channel itself. So the Mara Fulda is going to give a following explanation. He's going to say, according to this explanation, the Gemara originally stated that a channel does not divide the field unless it is so wide that even a person standing in the middle is unable to harvest the two sides. The Gemara concludes that it suffices for a person standing on one side to be unable to harvest the other side of the channel. So Rabbi Yehuda is holding that if the two sides of the channel cannot be harvested together, it divides the field even if the water is not constantly flowing. So the Mishnah is going to get into all the hills. The Gemara is going to get into the statement from the Mishnah and all the hills. The Gemara discusses a related subject. Rabbi Chia bar Ada says, in the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, if there was a rock along the length of one's entire field, the law is as follows. The Sugya says, if the rock is so tall that he must lift the plow from one side and pull it down on the other side, the rock divides the field. But if not, if he does not have to lift the plow over the rock, it does not divide the field. So now we're talking about these giant boulders that you can see all over the place in the Jerusalem hills. Some of them are very, very large. And they're wondering now, is that going to constitute a division, that if on one side of a boulder you planted a field and on the other side of the boulder you planted another field, and maybe the patch doesn't connect except for with this theoretical boulder. It's basically saying that the boulder in some cases can divide the field. In other words, if you have to lift the plow, then it's going to divide the field. But if it's not big enough where you don't have to lift the plow, then it doesn't divide the field. The Gemara is going to object. Now, maybe it's not such an objection. Maybe it's more of a refinement of the law. So the Gemara is going to say like this. It says, a Baraisa teaches that in the cases of terraces that are 10 tefachim high, where each terrace is 10 tefachim higher than the one below it, one must give Peah for each and every terrace. And the Baraisa implies that if the terraces are less than 10 tefachim, one may give Peah from one terrace for all of them. However, Rabbi Chia Bar Ada says even the terraces are less than 10 tefachim, one should still require its own Peah, for would he not have to lift the plow from this side of the incline between the terraces and put it on the other side? And just as Rabbi Chia Bar Ada ruled that a rock divides a field if the plow has to be lifted over it, so would he rule that the terraces are divided if the plow has to be lifted from one side of the terrace to the other side of the terrace? So then the question is, how then would he explain the Baraisa, which states that the terraces are not divided unless they're separated by 10 tefachim? Now, if you look in a lot of hilly, rocky terrain, historically, they'll divide up the land with terraces. You see that all the time with farming in Southeast Asia, where they'll do rice farms in terraces, and it'll go in levels where it goes up a hill in levels. And so now, if you're doing the same thing in these areas as you drive into Jerusalem along these rocky ways, where you're building out terraces for the farming for seed crop, are you going to have to leave one group of Peah, or are you going to leave many, one for each terrace? And again, we have a special rule in the tradition about everything that's 10 tefachim high. We know that the ark was 10 tefachim high, and we know that when Hashem was speaking to Moshe Rabbeinu, that there was this special thing where the voice came down to 10 tefachim high, but not any lower than that. So there's always a rule in the Halacha where you have 10 tefachim and higher and 10 tefachim and lower. That's really what it's asking. The Gemara is going to answer. It's going to say, indeed, even a terrace less than 10 tefachim requires its own Peah because one must lift the plow to bring it there. So why does the Baraisa specify 10 tefachim? So the Sugya answers and says, it mentions 10 tefachim only because of its final statement. If the edges of the terrace merge into a single furrow that runs up the entire height of the mountain, connecting all the terraces one to another, one may give Peah from one terrace for them all. The Bryce is basically specifying that 10 tefachim because it wants to teach that in this last case where the terraces merge, a single Peah is going to suffice even if the terraces are 10 tefachim. So in other words, it's saying that we have this law that 10 tefachim is going to start to create its own space, so that even if it's 10 tefachim high from one terrace to the other, if you have this trail that goes up this hill or mountain connecting terrace to terrace to terrace to terrace, where on that one area you wouldn't have to lift your plow, but on the other areas it's all terraced, it's going to be one Peah. But If you had to lift your plow and it wasn't connected with this sort of path, then it's going to be 1 peah for each terrace. Now we're going to continue with Halacha 3 about trees.